After my husband died, I transferred $500 every month to pay off his debts. But one day the bank called me. "Ma'am, your husband never had any debts." When I asked where my money had been going all this time. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to believe that grief had a shape you could see coming, like a storm on the horizon. I was wrong. Robert and I had been married for 19 years when his heart simply stopped on a Tuesday morning while he was tying his shoes. 19 years of Sunday pancakes, of him humming off-key in the shower, of small arguments about the thermostat that never once felt like real anger. I was 54 years old, and I had never imagined a life without him in our little house outside Dayton, Ohio. The first few months after the funeral are still blurry in my memory. A fog of casseroles left on the porch, sympathy cards I couldn't bring myself to throw away, and silence that pressed against my ears at night. It was in that fog that Carol came to me. Carol was Robert's older sister, a sharp-tongued woman who had never quite warmed to me, not in 19 years. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, her hands folded the way they always were when she was about to deliver bad news, and she told me that Robert had been hiding something. "Debts," she said. "Gambling debts, Linda. He didn't want you to know. He was ashamed." I remember staring at her, certain I had misheard. Robert balanced our checkbook to the penny. He clipped coupons. He was, if anything, too cautious with money, not too reckless. But Carol had brought papers, printed statements with numbers that made my stomach drop, a name of a collection agency I didn't recognize, and her own quiet insistence that she didn't want to see me drag the family name through a public bankruptcy. Beside her sat Brooke, Robert's daughter from his first marriage, 28 years old and dry-eyed in a way that should have told me something. "There's a way to handle this quietly," Brooke said. "A private repayment plan, $500 a month. It keeps it off the record, keeps Dad's name clean." Grief makes you stupid. I know that now. Grief makes you grateful for anyone who hands you a plan when you have none of your own. So I agreed. I wired $500 on the first of every month to an account Carol set up, made out to something called Heritage Resolution Services. I told myself it was the last gift I could give Robert, protecting the reputation he'd worked so hard to build as a respected high school teacher in our town. 14 months passed this way, 14 checks, $7,000. I quietly bled out of my modest savings, the same savings Robert and I had built for a retirement we never got to share. I told myself it was almost over. Carol said the debt was shrinking. I never saw a final number. I never saw a contract. I never once questioned why a debt collection agency wanted personal checks instead of a formal payment portal. Why Carol always insisted on cash transfers through her own personal banking app instead of a business account. The first crack came on an ordinary Thursday in March. I was at the kitchen table, the same one Carol had sat at with her folded hands, going through old paperwork because I'd finally decided to refinance the house. I called Robert's old bank, First Heritage Trust, just to confirm there were no liens attached to our joint accounts before I moved forward. The woman on the phone, a kind-voiced representative named Diane, put me on hold for what felt like an eternity. When she came back, her tone had changed. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I'm looking at your husband's full credit history with us, going back to 2003. There's no debt here. There never was. Your husband's accounts were always in excellent standing. He didn't owe First Heritage a single dollar." I sat very still. The phone pressed so hard against my ear it hurt. "That's not possible," I said. "There were collection notices, a repayment plan." "I don't know what to tell you," Diane said gently. "There's nothing here, not even a late payment." I hung up the phone and looked at the stack of collection statements Carol had given me over a year ago, the ones I had never thought to question because grief doesn't leave room for suspicion. My hands were shaking. 14 months, $7,000, and somewhere in that quiet house that still smelled faintly of Robert's aftershave, a single question began to form in my mind, cold and sharp as broken glass. If my husband never had any debts at all, then where exactly had my money been going? I sat at that kitchen table for nearly an hour after I hung up the phone, the late afternoon light sliding across the floor in long amber stripes, and I did not move. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes over a person in the moment they realize they have been deceived by people they trusted. Not the dramatic stillness of shock you see in movies, but something quieter and heavier, like a stone settling at the bottom of a lake. I thought about Carol's folded hands. I thought about Brooke's dry eyes. I thought about how easily I had believed them, because believing them had felt at the time like the last act of love I could perform for Robert. When I finally moved, it was to pull out a legal pad and a pen, the same pad I had once used to plan Robert's 60th birthday party that never came. I wrote the number 14 at the top of the page, 14 months of payments, and beneath it I wrote $500. Then I did the math I had been too numb with grief to do in real time. $7,000. Not money I had lying around carelessly. Money from the retirement account Robert and I had built together over 2 decades of careful living, of skipped vacations and modest cars, so that we could grow old together without worry. He never got to grow old. And now $7,000 of what should have been my cushion, my safety net as a widow alone, had vanished into an account called Heritage Resolution Services that, as far as I could tell, had no connection to any real institution at all. I won't pretend I wasn't afraid. Fear came in waves that evening. Fear of what it would mean to accuse Robert's own sister of fraud. Fear of what Brooke would say to the rest of the family. Fear of being the bitter widow who tore apart what was left of her husband's relatives over money. I had spent my whole life avoiding conflict. I was the woman who apologized when someone else bumped into me in the grocery store. The idea of standing across from Carol and calling her a liar to her face made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with dread. But somewhere underneath the fear, something else was rising, something that felt almost unfamiliar after 14 months of quiet mourning. Anger. Not the hot, reckless kind, but a slow, steady burn, the kind that comes from realizing that someone looked at your grief and saw not a person to comfort, but a wallet to open. Robert had trusted his sister. Robert had loved his daughter, even through the strain of his first divorce. And someone, maybe both of them, had used his memory, his good name, as a weapon to take money from his widow while she was too broken to ask questions. I thought about calling Carol right then, demanding answers over the phone, but I made myself put the phone down. I had learned enough in 19 years of marriage to a careful man to know that confronting someone with no evidence in hand only gives them time to build a story. If Carol and Brooke had done this deliberately, they would already have an explanation ready, smooth and reasonable, the moment I raised my voice. I needed something better than my own outrage. I needed proof. That night, I sat at the table long after the sun went down, the legal pad filling slowly with notes. I wrote down every payment date I could remember. I dug through old emails for any communication from Heritage Resolution Services and found, troublingly, almost nothing. No official letterhead, no tax ID, no working customer service number. Just a single email address that bounced back when I tried to reply to it. I found the routing number Carol had given me for the transfers and wrote it down twice, underlining it because something about a personal routing number attached to a supposed collection agency struck me, even in my limited financial knowledge, as deeply wrong. By midnight, I had made a decision. I would not call Carol. I would not call Brooke. Instead, in the morning, I would call a lawyer. Not a family friend, not someone who might feel obligated to soften the truth for the sake of keeping peace at Thanksgiving, but a real attorney who specialized in financial fraud, someone with no loyalty to anyone in this story but me. I would request the full transaction history from my bank, and I would find out piece by piece exactly where my money had gone and exactly who had taken it. For the first time in 14 months, I went to bed not thinking about Robert's absence, but about Robert's voice. Calm, careful, the voice he used when grading essays or balancing our budget, telling me the way he always had to slow down and look at the facts before reacting. I fell asleep with the legal pad still open beside me, the first real plan of my new life as a widow taking rough shape in blue ink. The law office of Marisol Vance sat above a dry cleaner on Patterson Boulevard, a modest space with worn carpet and a view of the parking lot, but I had chosen her carefully. Marisol specialized in elder and widow financial exploitation cases, a fact I had found buried 3 pages deep in an online search the night before. When I sat across from her desk the following Monday morning, my legal pad and bank statement spread out between us, she listened without interrupting for nearly 20 minutes, her pen moving steadily across a yellow notepad. "Mrs. Mercer," she said finally, setting her pen down, "I want to be direct with you. What you're describing has a name. It's a common pattern in cases of what we call grief-based financial exploitation, family members who use a person's vulnerability right after a death to extract money under false pretenses. I'm not saying that's definitely what happened here. But the structure of this, the vague paperwork, the personal routing number instead of a business account, the lack of any verifiable institution, Hasa, it concerns me." She agreed to take my case, and within the week she had filed a formal request with First Heritage Trust for the complete transaction history tied to both my account and the supposed Heritage Resolution Services, account number Carol had given me. Banks move slowly, even with an attorney pushing, and the weight felt unbearable. In the meantime, Marisol advised me to say nothing to Carol or Brooke. "Let them believe everything is normal," she said. People who are hiding something get careless when they think no one is looking. It was harder advice to follow than I expected. 3 days after my appointment with Marisol, Carol called me, her voice syrupy with concern, asking how I was holding up and whether the next payment had gone through smoothly. I forced my voice into the same flat, grateful tone I had used for 14 months. Of course, I told her, same as always. But something in my hesitation must have registered because she lingered a beat too long before saying goodbye, and Brooke texted me the next morning an oddly specific question about whether I'd spoken to the bank lately. I didn't answer. I stared at that text for a long time, feeling the cold certainty settle deeper into my chest. They were watching me as closely as I was watching them. It took 11 days for the bank records to arrive. Marisol called me into her office on a rainy Thursday afternoon, and I remember the sound of the rain against the window as she slid a thick folder across the desk toward me. "I want you to look at this," she said, "and I want you to take your time." The transaction history told a story far uglier than I had imagined. The account labeled Heritage Resolution Services was not, as I'd assumed, some shadowy collection agency at all. It was a personal checking account opened 18 months earlier, 2 months before Robert's death, under the name Carol A. Whitfield. Not a business, not an agency. My sister-in-law's own bank account, registered using her home address, 3 streets away from the house where Robert and I had raised no children but built 19 years of quiet life together. And tucked into the folder, Marisol had also obtained, through a subpoena issued the week before for a related civil inquiry, a printout from a payment processing service showing recurring transfers, not collection payments to creditors, but transfers from that same account directly to Brooke's personal Venmo, almost monthly, in amounts ranging from $100 to $300. I felt the room tilt slightly. Robert had never owed anyone a cent. There had never been a debt, never a collection agency, never anything but 2 women, his sister and his daughter, who had looked at a grieving widow and built, brick by brick, a quiet, believable lie designed to drain her for as long as she didn't ask questions. "This is enough to move forward," Marisol said quietly, watching my face. "This is documented financial fraud, Linda. We can file a formal complaint. We can pursue civil recovery, and depending on what the district attorney's office decides, this could become criminal." I sat with the folder in my lap, my hands no longer shaking the way they had on that first Thursday in March. Something had shifted inside me, some final door closing on the version of myself who had trusted blindly, who had wired $500 a month out of love and grief and the desperate need to do right by a man who could no longer speak for himself. There would be no more quiet payments, no more soft questions over the phone, hiding suspicion behind a grateful tone. I looked up at Marisol and said the only thing that made sense to say. "Let's do it. Let's file." I didn't know yet how hard Carol and Brooke would fight once they realized I knew. I didn't know about the threats that were coming or the long, cold nights of doubt still ahead of me. But sitting in that small office above the dry cleaner, the rain still tapping steadily against the glass, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Robert's heart gave out on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I felt like myself again. Marisol filed the civil complaint on a Monday, and by Wednesday my phone had not stopped ringing. I let most of the calls go to voicemail, but I listened to every single one of them that evening, sitting alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in front of me. The first few from Carol were almost pleading. "Linda, there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Please call me back before you do anything you'll regret." By Thursday, the tone had shifted entirely. "You ungrateful woman," Carol's voice spat from my voicemail, no longer bothering with sweetness. "After everything this family did for you, Robert would be ashamed of what you're doing to his sister." I played that message twice, my jaw tight, and then I forwarded it directly to Marisol, who told me to save every single recording. "This is good for us," she said, with a calm that I was starting to find steadying rather than strange. "Threats and intimidation only strengthen a fraud case. Keep documenting everything." But it was Brooke's visit 3 days later that frightened me the most. She came to the house unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, and when I opened the door, her face had none of the dry-eyed composure I remembered from the kitchen table 14 months earlier. She was furious, and beneath the fury, something close to panic. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said, pushing past me into the entryway without being invited. "If this goes to court, I'll tell everyone what kind of wife you really were. How you and Dad were having problems before he died. How you wanted out of that marriage. People will believe me, Linda. They always believe the grieving daughter over the second wife." It was a lie, of course. Robert and I had never had problems, not the kind she was implying, and anyone who had truly known us would have laughed at the suggestion. But standing in my own entryway, watching Brooke's hands shake with anger, I understood with sudden clarity what Marisol had meant about people getting careless. Brooke wasn't trying to defend her innocence. She was trying to manufacture leverage, a story ugly enough to make me back down out of fear of public humiliation. I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. "Get out of my house, Brooke," I said, "and if you contact me again outside of our attorneys, I'll add it to the file." She left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the framed photo of Robert and me on our 10th anniversary, the one hanging in the hallway. I stood there for a long moment after she'd gone, staring at that photo, at Robert's easy smile, and I let myself cry. Not from fear exactly, but from the exhausting weight of confrontation, of being threatened by people who had once sat at holiday dinners beside me. Over the following 2 weeks, the pressure didn't entirely let up, but it changed shape. Carol stopped calling and instead had a family friend, a woman named Patricia, who had known Robert since childhood, reach out to mediate. I declined. Brooke sent one final text, this one almost businesslike in tone, suggesting that if I dropped the complaint, she and Carol would quietly repay what was owed, no lawyers involved. Marisol was unequivocal when I showed her the message. "Absolutely not," she said. "That's an admission disguised as an offer, and it's worth far less than what discovery will get us. Don't respond." I didn't respond, and then, almost as suddenly as the pressure had started, it seemed to pause. No calls, no visits, no texts. Whether Carol and Brooke had retreated to consult their own lawyer, or whether they had simply run out of angles to try, I didn't know, and for the first time in weeks, the silence felt less like a threat and more like room to breathe. I took that room. I told Marisol I needed a few days before the next round of filings, and she agreed it was wise. I drove 2 hours to visit my sister in Columbus, someone I hadn't leaned on enough since Robert's death, and for 3 days I did almost nothing. Slept late, walked along the river near her apartment, let her cook for me the way she used to when we were girls, and one of us had a bad week. I didn't talk about Carol or Brooke much at all. I just let myself exist, quietly, away from the fight, gathering whatever strength I would need for what Marisol had already warned me was coming next. Because fraud cases, she'd told me gently before I left, rarely end with one retreat. People like Carol and Brooke don't simply give up. They regroup. And when I drove back toward Dayton on the 4th morning, the autumn light, pale and thin over the highway, some quiet, steady part of me understood that the hardest part of this fight was almost certainly still ahead. The days following my visit to my sister's apartment had a strange, suspended quality to them, like the stillness before a storm makes landfall. Carol and Brooke had gone quiet, but Marisol warned me repeatedly not to mistake silence for surrender. "They're regrouping," she said during one of our weekly calls. "People like this don't disappear. They watch. They wait for a moment when you seem tired or unsure, and then they try a different approach." She was right, though the approach that came wasn't what I expected. It wasn't another threat. It was an offer, delivered not by Carol or Brooke directly, but through a check that arrived in my mailbox on an ordinary Tuesday, drawn from Carol's personal account for the full amount of $7,000, with a handwritten note clipped to it that read, simply, "No hard feelings. Let's put this behind us as a family." I sat at the kitchen table holding that check for a long time. There was a version of me, the exhausted, conflict-averse version who had wired $500 a month without question for over a year, who wanted desperately to deposit it, sign whatever paperwork made the lawyers go away, and try to rebuild some fragile peace with what remained of Robert's family. But I had changed enough in the past several weeks to recognize the offer for what it was, an attempt to make the fraud disappear quietly, with no formal admission, no legal consequence, nothing on record except a tidy resolution that would let Carol and Brooke walk away with their reputations intact. I called Marisol before I had even finished my coffee. "Do not cash it," she said immediately. "If you cash that check, it could be argued as a private settlement, and it weakens our position considerably. Mail it back certified, with no note. Let your silence speak for you." I did exactly that, and I felt, sealing that envelope, a coldness settle over me that surprised even myself. Not anger, not fear, but something steadier, calm. The kind of calm that comes when you finally understand exactly what game is being played, and you decide quietly that you are no longer interested in playing along to keep others comfortable. Carol and Brooke did not attempt contact again that week. According to Marisol's contacts, they had quietly retained their own attorney, a sign that they understood finally that this was not going to dissolve on its own. I imagined them somewhere across town, in Carol's tidy living room perhaps, watching and waiting, the way a predator watches from the tall grass when its prey has unexpectedly turned to face it. What surprised me most during that strange, watchful period was how much I needed other people, and how willing they turned out to be to show up for me. My sister called every other day, sometimes just to talk about nothing, a recipe she'd tried, a show she was watching, And I understood gradually that those small, ordinary conversations were doing as much to steady me as anything Marisol said in her office. I reconnected, almost by accident, with an old friend from my years teaching elementary school, a woman named Denise who had drifted out of regular contact after Robert and I moved across town a decade earlier. When I told her, hesitantly, what had happened, she didn't flinch or offer empty sympathy. She simply said, "Good for you for fighting it." And then she started showing up, bringing dinner some evenings, sitting with me while I sorted through more paperwork, asking sharp, practical questions that helped me see the case more clearly than my own anxious mind could on its own. I also found, almost unexpectedly, a kind of support I hadn't known existed, a small local group for widows navigating financial exploitation, which Marisol had mentioned almost in passing. I attended my first meeting in the basement of a community church on a Wednesday evening, nervous and unsure I belonged there. But the women in that room, 6 of them, ranging from their 40s to their 80s, had stories that echoed mine in ways that made my chest ache with recognition. A stepson who'd forged a power of attorney, a financial advisor cousin who'd drained a retirement account. Listening to them, and slowly, haltingly, telling my own story aloud for the first time outside of Marisol's office, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since that first Thursday phone call from the bank. I left that meeting with 3 new phone numbers, and for the first time since Robert's death, a feeling that I was not facing this alone in the way I had been facing my grief, quietly, privately, without anyone to lean on. Carol and Brooke had tried to buy my silence with a check, and I had mailed it back unsigned. Whatever came next, I understood now. I would not be facing it from the same isolated, grief-numbed place I had been in 14 months earlier. I had people now, and I had, more than anything, my own steady resolve, sharpened rather than weakened by every attempt to shake it. It was Denise who first warned me that Carol had called her, fishing for information under the guise of concern, and it was that small piece of news that told me the quiet period was ending. Sure enough, 2 days later, on a gray Sunday afternoon, I heard a car pull into my driveway and looked out to see both Carol and Brooke stepping out together, dressed not in the sharp, business-like clothes I associated with our recent conflict, but in soft cardigans and contrite expressions, the kind of appearance clearly meant to evoke family, warmth, reconciliation. I almost didn't open the door. Marisol had cautioned me against unsupervised meetings, but something in me, call it stubbornness, or perhaps simple curiosity about how far they were willing to go, made me crack the door and let them stand on my porch instead of inviting them inside. "We just want to talk, Linda," Carol said, her voice soft now, none of the venom from the voicemail weeks earlier. "Family to family. No lawyers." "We've been thinking about Robert a lot," Brooke added, her eyes glistening in a way that, this time, I recognized immediately as performance rather than grief. He wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want us tearing each other apart. There was a time, not so long ago, when those words would have unraveled me completely. The invocation of Robert's wishes, the suggestion that my pursuit of the truth was itself a betrayal of his memory. I felt the old pull of it, faint but present, a flicker of the guilt that had once made me write checks without question. But underneath that flicker was something sturdier now, built over weeks of bank records and voicemails and a small church basement full of women who understood exactly what this performance was. Robert would want the truth, I said quietly. He'd want to know that his sister opened a personal account using his memory to take money from his widow. That's what he'd want, Carol, not silence. Her face shifted, the softness dropping away almost instantly, replaced by something tighter and more familiar. You don't understand what it's like, she snapped, watching my brother build a life with someone who was never really part of this family. We needed that money, Linda. Brooke's been struggling since her divorce. I lost half my retirement in 2022. You had plenty. You always had plenty. There it was. The justification beneath the manipulation. The belief that my grief and my modest savings had simply been a resource they were entitled to. A debt I owed them not because of any actual wrongdoing on my part, but because I had been the one left standing, the one with something left to take. I felt something settle inside me, cold and clear. That doesn't make it legal, I said, and it doesn't make it forgivable. You used Robert's death to steal from me for 14 months. I'm not interested in pretending that's a family disagreement. Brooke's composure cracked entirely then, the soft cardigan and glistening eyes giving way to raw fury. You'll regret this, she hissed. When this goes public, nobody in this town is going to look at you the same way. We'll make sure of it. That's a threat, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I hope you understand that. I'm closing this conversation now, and everything you've just said is going straight to my attorney. I shut the door, my hands trembling only slightly, and through the wood I heard Carol's voice rising, sharp and furious, Brooks following close behind, before the sound of their car doors slamming and the engine pulling hard out of my driveway. I stood in my hallway for a long moment afterward, my heart pounding, a thin current of fear running beneath my ribs. Fear of what making sure of it might actually mean. Fear of small-town gossip, of the version of this story they might try to spread before the truth caught up to it. But beneath that fear, something else was growing steadier by the second. Resolve. I had stood on my own porch and told two furious women the plain, unflinching truth, and I had not crumbled. I called Marisol that evening and recounted the entire conversation while it was still fresh, and she listened with the same careful attention she always gave me before saying, "This helps us more than it hurts you, Linda. Threats made directly to your face, with witnesses we can establish through your neighbor's doorbell camera footage if needed, only build the case further. You did exactly the right thing." I sat on my back porch that night long after the sun went down, wrapped in one of Robert's old sweaters that still, faintly, smelled like him, and I let myself feel the fear fully, without pretending it wasn't there. But I let it sit beside the resolve rather than beneath it. Carol and Brooke had come to my house hoping to manipulate me back into silence, and instead they had handed me, unknowingly, one more piece of evidence, one more thread in the rope that was slowly, steadily tightening around the lie they had built. The civil hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October, 11 months after that first phone call from the bank had cracked everything open. I had imagined this moment so many times in the weeks leading up to it that the reality of walking into the county courthouse, Marisol beside me with her leather folder full of evidence, felt almost unreal. The fluorescent lights, the hard wooden benches, the the low murmur of other cases being called before ours. Carol and Brooke arrived with their own attorney, a younger man who looked perpetually uncomfortable, as though he had only recently understood the full weight of what he'd been asked to defend. They didn't look at me as they took their seats. Carol's jaw was set tight, and Brooke kept her eyes fixed on the table in front of her, a far cry from the dry-eyed composure of that first kitchen table conversation, 14 months, now nearly 2 years, earlier. Marisol's opening was methodical and unhurried. She walked the judge through the bank records first. The personal account opened by Carol Whitfield 2 months before Robert's death, the recurring transfers to Brooke's Venmo, the complete absence of any legitimate debt collection agency named Heritage Resolution Services in any state or federal registry. Then came the voicemails, played aloud in the quiet courtroom, Carol's voice sharp and unmistakable. "You ungrateful woman, after everything this family did for you." I watched Carol's face as her own recorded fury filled the room, watched her attorney's jaw tighten in real time. When it was Carol's turn to testify, her composure, the same brittle control she had maintained through every phone call and porch confrontation, finally began to fracture. She tried at first to claim the account had been a misunderstanding, a temporary holding account for debts she insisted had been real, even as Marisol calmly produced, one by one, the complete absence of any documentation supporting their existence. When pressed about the routing number used, the personal nature of the transfers, the lack of any contract or written agreement ever shown to me, Carol's answers grew tangled, contradicting things she had said only minutes before. "I was trying to help my brother's memory," she said at one point, her voice cracking. "I was trying to protect this family by taking $7,000 from his widow," Marisol said evenly, not as a question, simply a statement laid into the record, using an account that existed solely for that purpose, opened before he had even died. The silence that followed in the courtroom felt enormous. Carol had no answer for it because there wasn't one. I sat very still beside Marisol, my hands folded in my lap, and I felt none of the trembling fear that had gripped me on my own front porch weeks earlier. What I felt instead was something close to clarity, the strange, settled calm of watching a lie that had once seemed enormous and unshakable collapse under the simple, patient weight of facts. Brooke's testimony was worse for them, if anything. Under questioning, she admitted, haltingly, that she had known from the beginning that there were no actual debts, that the entire scheme had been Carol's idea after she'd lost a significant portion of her retirement savings in a bad investment, and that Brooke had agreed to participate because she needed help after her divorce. It was the first fully honest thing either of them had said since this began, and it landed in the courtroom with the particular weight that comes when a carefully maintained story finally gives way entirely. I did not raise my voice once during that hearing. I did not need to. I answered the questions Marisol and the judge asked me plainly, recounting the timeline as I had documented it from the very beginning. The kitchen table conversation, the 14 months of payments, the phone call from Diane at First Heritage Trust that had cracked the whole story open. My voice stayed steady throughout, not because I had stopped feeling the weight of what had happened to me, but because I had spent nearly a year preparing for this exact moment, building, fact by fact, the case that was now unfolding exactly as Marisol had promised it would. By the time the judge called for a recess before issuing findings, Carol would not look at me at all, and Brooke had her face buried in her hands. Their attorney sat very still beside them, the posture of a man who understood, finally and completely, that there was no version of closing arguments that could undo what had just been laid bare in open court. I sat in the hallway outside during the recess, Marisol beside me with a cup of vending machine coffee she'd bought for each of us, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt something settle fully into place inside my chest. Not yet relief, not quite, but the unmistakable steady sense that the truth, slow and exhausting as it had been to uncover, was about to be heard, in full, by someone with the power to make it matter. The judge's findings, issued that same afternoon after the recess, were unambiguous. Carol Whitfield and Brooke Mercer Hayes were found to have engaged in deliberate financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Ohio law. Marisol explained to me afterward in the quiet of the courthouse hallway that my status as a recent widow at the time the scheme began had qualified the case for enhanced protections typically reserved for exploitation of the elderly or grieving. The judge ordered full restitution of the $7,000 plus interest accrued over the nearly 2 years since the scheme began, plus legal fees. But more than the financial judgment, it was the referral that mattered most. The judge's explicit recommendation that the case be forwarded to the county prosecutor's office for review of criminal fraud charges, given the deliberate, premeditated nature of the account Carol had opened before Robert's death. I did not feel triumphant sitting in that courtroom as the ruling was read aloud. I felt mostly exhausted in the particular way that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. Carol's face had gone pale and rigid. Brooke was crying openly now, though whether from guilt or simply the realization of consequences finally arriving, I couldn't say and didn't especially care to guess. The criminal investigation moved faster than Marisol had expected, perhaps because the civil case had already assembled such a complete record. Within 3 months, the county prosecutor's office filed formal fraud charges against both women. Carol, facing the larger share of culpability as the one who had opened the account and orchestrated the scheme, eventually accepted a plea agreement that included a suspended sentence contingent on full restitution, 5 years of probation, and a permanent fraud conviction on her record. Brooke's plea was lighter, given her secondary role and her full cooperation once the case had unraveled in court, but it still left her with a conviction, a period of probation, and a debt to repay that her unstable finances made nearly impossible to manage quickly. There was no dramatic confrontation after the sentencing, no final scene where Carol begged for forgiveness or Brooke admitted tearfully to some deeper remorse. The truth of fraud cases, I learned, is quieter and far less cinematic than people imagine. Carol simply stopped attending any family gatherings that included me. Not that there were many left, since most of what remained of Robert's extended family had quietly distanced themselves from both her and Brooke once the details of the case became known in our small community. Word travels fast in a town the size of ours, and a fraud conviction involving a grieving widow is the kind of story that does not stay contained for long, regardless of how desperately Carol and Brooke had once tried to control the narrative themselves. I received my restitution in full, paid out over an 18-month structured settlement that Carol's modest income could sustain, supervised by the court. It would never undo the 14 months of fear and grief-fogged trust I had given away so freely, but it closed, finally and completely, the chapter that had begun with that first call from Diane at First Heritage Trust. Marisol shook my hand outside the courthouse on the day the final paperwork was settled, the autumn air sharp and clean around us, and told me something I have carried with me since. "Most people never get this kind of resolution," she said. "Most exploitation cases like yours end quietly, with a family member never held accountable at all, because the victim is too exhausted or too afraid of the social cost to see it through. You didn't let that happen. That matters more than you probably realize right now." I drove home that evening past the house where Carol had lived for the past 15 years. The house now listed for sale, a side effect of the restitution payments and the legal fees she could no longer comfortably absorb on her salary alone. I felt no satisfaction looking at that sign in her yard, no triumphant rush of vindication. What I felt instead, pulling into my own driveway as the last light faded behind the trees, was something quieter and far more durable. The simple, settled knowledge that I had told the truth, followed it all the way through, and that the people who had tried to exploit my grief for their own benefit had been forced, finally, to answer for it in full. It has been almost 3 years now since that Thursday phone call from Diane at First Heritage Trust changed the course of my life, and I can say, with a certainty I would not have believed possible during those 14 months of quiet, grief-fogged payments, that my life today is a genuinely happy one. I sold the house outside Dayton 2 years ago, not out of bitterness toward the place where Robert and I had built our life together, but because I had finally understood, sitting in that kitchen so many times during the legal proceedings, that I wanted a fresh start somewhere that didn't carry the weight of either my grief or my fight for justice in every room. I moved closer to my sister in Columbus, into a small but bright 2-bedroom condo with a view of a park where I walk most mornings before the city fully wakes. I used a portion of the restitution money, along with some retraining support I found through the same widows support group that had carried me through the hardest months, to complete a certification in financial counseling. I now spend 3 days a week working with a local nonprofit that helps elderly and recently widowed clients protect themselves from exactly the kind of exploitation I once lived through. There is a particular quiet satisfaction in sitting across from a frightened, grieving woman, recognizing the exact shape of what she's afraid to say out loud, and helping her ask the questions I never knew to ask in time. Denise and I remain close, and the small church basement support group has become, improbably, one of the steadiest sources of friendship in my life. We still meet most Wednesdays, though our membership has shifted and grown over the years, new women arriving with new versions of the same painful story, finding, I hope, some of the same strength I found there. Carol's life, from what I've heard through the thin, persistent thread of small-town gossip that never fully disappears even after a move, has not recovered easily. The sale of her house barely covered her remaining restitution obligations and the steep legal fees from her own defense. She lost her position at the accounting firm where she'd worked for over a decade once her employer learned of the fraud conviction, and finding comparable work afterward proved difficult in a field where trust is the entire currency. She lives now, I'm told, in a small rental apartment 2 towns over, largely estranged from what remains of the extended family, most of whom quietly cut contact once the full details of the case became public knowledge in a community that does not easily forget. Brooke's path has been similarly difficult. Her divorce, already strained before any of this began, finalized acrimoniously not long after her conviction, and her ex-husband used the fraud charge effectively in the custody proceedings that followed, resulting in a custody arrangement far more limited than she had hoped for with her 2 young children. She moved out of state 2 years ago, according to Denise, who still hears occasional updates through a mutual acquaintance and works now in a job considerably below the career she had once been building before her conviction made background checks in her field nearly impossible to clear. I won't pretend I feel no sadness at all when I hear these updates. Brooke, in particular, was once a young woman I had hoped, in the early years of my marriage to Robert, to build something like a real relationship with, however complicated her feelings about her father's second marriage had always been. But sadness is not the same as regret. I do not regret even slightly the choice I made on that ordinary Thursday in March, sitting at my kitchen table with the phone still warm in my hand to find out the truth rather than continue paying quietly into a lie. What I have now, instead, is a life built on my own steady ground rather than borrowed grief, a career that gives my days real purpose, a small but fierce circle of women who understand exactly what it costs me to stand up for myself, and a quiet, hard-won confidence that I carry into every difficult conversation since. I think of Robert often still, especially in the early mornings on my walks through the park near my new home. I believe, with the same certainty I once reserved only for grief, that he would be proud of the woman who finally, fully, refused to let his memory be used as a weapon against her. The truth, however long it takes to uncover, is always worth the fight. So I'll leave you with the same question I've asked myself many nights since. If someone you trusted used your grief against you, what would you do? If this story moved you, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Thank you so much for listening.